Okay. I probably won't spend much time reviewing what we did last night. Basically, we're in a new book of the Torah right now, and it's a long Torah portion. You can see it's basically 5 full chapters because it goes from 1:1 to 6:1. But that gives us lots of information to pick from. And so what I picked was the straw, the making of the bricks and the straw and so forth. We wanted to see what's the connection of the straw to its first mention, and then maybe to some things that would connect us to the feast of Asif, also known as Sukkot. So last night we went over a logical fallacy called the straw man. At least that's what it's called in modern English. But the example was when Moses and Aaron came to Pharaoh and said, let the people go, that they can celebrate a feast to me in the wilderness. Pharaoh completely changes the point. He starts exercising the straw man. He completely ignores that it's a matter of worship, that they want to be free to worship their God, not one of the 2,000 gods of Egypt, but the God of Israel. And so he just changes the topic basically and says they're lazy. This really isn't about, a war of the worlds and a matter of spiritual authority. They're just lazy. And last night we talked about how often those accusations come up, even among believers, sadly, among believers, that people have it's not a great ability, but it's pretty consistent. We can see it manifest in politics for sure, where people have a great talent for completely missing the point, especially when the point is not their point. When it's someone else's point, they will select the most extreme example. They will ignore salient information, and they won't really respond to what the question or the problem or the argument is. And so what Pharaoh does by exercising the straw man, basically he just says, oh, it's not because of any desire on your part to demonstrate an act of faith. You're just lazy. And we pointed out that a lot of times as we're navigating through this walk, we're trying to keep the Shabbat, we're trying to keep the feasts, or we're trying to keep kosher, whatever we're trying to do. Often what people accuse us of is the last thing that actually is our motivation. And our motivation is to worship the Holy One of Israel in the manner in which he has asked to be worshiped, not one that we've invented. And so they will tend to ignore that question because it's way too uncomfortable to address that. Are these people actually worshiping in a valid, holy, commanded way? And when they do that, it actually points out the 2,000 other gods that I'm worshiping that I shouldn't be, or it's pointing out to me that I'm not God. And that's uncomfortable, and that's when you'll probably see the straw man engage, when someone, and it might be a minor point, and typically, you don't have an argument if you don't have at least one valid point. They might package it up in a bunch of foolishness, but if you listen, in there embedded is some truth. And so in the straw man, we tend to ignore the most important truth and focus on an exaggeration or delete important information that would actually lead us to make a balanced response. You see this all over Facebook. It's all in politics. There's not anybody anywhere, if you are alive and breathing, that is not encountering this on a daily basis. It's increasing. So we also talked about the tzila, that supernatural bug, how it causes confusion from above, and then it destroys the fruit below. And we talked about how Moses disappeared, how he and Aaron bring this message, let the people go worship. And Pharaoh says, no, now you're going to go make your own straw. And after that, it's just like Moses goes silent. And this is when the rabbis say that he actually took his wife and his sons back to Midian, took them back to his father-in-law, and then he returned to Egypt. And this took approximately, they say, 6 months. Were they getting that? We don't know. But it's reasonable. If they're going to go celebrate a Chag, and Pharaoh does not permit it, instead he assigns more work, then when you calculate out the seasons of the Chagim, it makes perfect sense that he would return 6 months later where the issue could come up again. Let's see, we talked about this midrash about Esau and how Yeshua is basically giving the same example of pseudo-religious people, where they'll talk about the tithing of the straw was the least important part of the harvest and completely ignore the grain, which is that which can reproduce, that's going to have life, that's going to be qualified for a first fruits, something that is going to most accurately represent the Father. Let's see. So we're going to skip through this. And this was the conclusion last night. So this is where we'll pick up. And the rabbis say that had Moses and Aaron not at least come and made that initial demand to be free to go worship and celebrate a Chag, that in this interim time where they seem to slip out, and now we've got the Hebrews running all over Egypt trying to find enough straw on Shabbat in order to make their brick quota, that is exactly what we can expect to happen to us. If we keep the Shabbat, if we keep the high Sabbaths of the feasts, then you can bet that this pattern that we're reading is also going to apply to you. I mean, we're told in the Brit Chadashah, why are you surprised when these things happen? Why are you shocked that these things are happening? Like, are you a prince and a princess and you don't think anything bad is ever going to happen to you, that you're not going to be accused of false motives when you try to walk with Yeshua? And, what you should be surprised is if you're not accused wrongly, if you're not suspected of ulterior motives, if somebody doesn't change the subject on you from whether you are trying to walk in faithfulness to the Father, and instead they'll accuse you of being lazy, manipulating the vacation schedule, misappropriating vacation money, all sorts of things. And in the long run, the intent, when they start pulling the straw man fallacy on you, it's meant to confuse you. So even you might be confused as to your motives, or even whether this is important, whether you will begin to justify. And that was the caution. When it feels as though the whole system is designed to crush Shabbat out of you, when it feels like Moses and Yeshua, they have called you into the feast, they have awakened you to the Shabbat, they gave you this gift of the Torah, and now they've disappeared on you. It's like there's no support here. I'm slugging this out by myself. And the rabbis say this must happen, that there's going to be a period, according to this pattern in the Torah portion, where there's going to be an awakening within Israel, and then it's just going to feel like Moses left. And now they're working harder than ever. And it was better before Moses came and revealed anything. They were better off. They didn't have to work as hard. But they say this must happen, that the Redeemer will disappear for a season before he reappears. But they say, had he not come, then they would have not had the courage to make it through this period of harder work, which would have come anyway. Kind of goes back to cause and effect. Did what Moses said really cause their hard work, or did Pharaoh? And would he have imposed harder and harder work anyway? The answer is likely yes. But Moses being in that place at that time, it was going to be easy to blame him. And then wonder where he disappeared to. You got us into this, and where did you go? And sometimes it feels that way with Yeshua. You got me into this walk, and then where did you go? Where's the support system? Why is it so hard to keep Shabbat? Why is it so hard to go to the feasts and so forth? But this has to happen. So one of the questions we wanted to ask, because people would, especially if they reject anything coming out of the Jewish sources, this is a midrash that's going to tell us that the gathering the straw in the field was designed to take away their Sabbath, because they were already working really hard 6 days a week, just like everybody else. And they say that by adding the straw, that what Pharaoh was doing was forcing them out into the fields on Shabbat to gather straw, so they couldn't keep the Shabbat, because they had to have that straw in order to do their 6 days of labor. And someone said, well, that's just, Jewish tradition. There's no mention of keeping Shabbat until Moses arrives on the scene, until they get these very explicit orders at Sinai. And that's one way of looking at it. But, let's not even make it into a, do you believe the rabbi's question? What if it's just, do you believe the Bible question? Because we have hard evidence that even prior to this time, we have righteous people who are keeping commandments that maybe aren't even mentioned in the Big Ten. They're keeping details that were not mentioned in the creation. Now, Shabbat is mentioned in the creation. It's the seventh day. But they're doing other things. They're keeping laws of nidah. They're tithing. They're recognizing a birthright. They're bringing sacrifices. They're exercising blessings. And they're doing all this before Sinai. So my question is, why wouldn't they keep Shabbat? Which, out of all those things, Shabbat would be the clearest universal commandment of creation, not just of the Jews, not just of Israel, but anybody who's willing to accept the first chapter of the Torah. Why wouldn't you rest? Now, you may not keep, all the laws, the current laws of Shabbat, but in some sense, would you have a recognition of the Shabbat? The answer would probably be yes. In fact, if they didn't know about Shabbats and high holy days to some extent, then how would Moshe even have known to request it? Why would he say, let me have permission to go celebrate a Chag, when the first Chag on record is the Shabbat itself? He's recognizing that it's a day of worship. It's a set apart day. It's not a day for routine labor. But going back again to the rabbi's commentary on the portion, saying this was an attempt on Pharaoh's part to extinguish Shabbat from Israel, because if he could stop them from observing it, that's how he could extinguish them as a people. Because remember, Israel is the Father's firstborn. They're an extension of the Father. They are going to be the vehicle through which his salvation is revealed to the world. Israel is how he is going to provide to the family. And so if you take Shabbat out of Israel, then they would cease to be a people. That's what distinguished them. Like Isaac, we were saying last night, where it talks about how Isaac and Abraham, there was 2 instances where it says the 2 of them walked together. In the first instance, they walked together in spite of the knife and the fire. And then in the second instance, they walked together because of the provision of the lamb. But before the lamb came the knife and the fire. There is an element of personal sacrifice that goes along with walking with the Father. And so even before we see a tabernacle or a temple built in the wilderness, what is it that would bind Israel together other than having a common ancestor in Abraham? Because when they're in Egypt, they have no ritualistic observance. They don't have a temple service. They don't have daily sacrifices in the Mishkan. They don't have incense offerings. They don't have any of these rituals that help them to maintain their identity. In Egypt, really all they have in terms of a common ritual, a common observance, something that everybody would do at the same time. It's Shabbat. Shabbat is the one thing when you don't have a temple, when you don't have a tabernacle. And so if they're facing this dilemma that in Egypt, the desire is to destroy their Shabbat, to destroy them as a people, and therefore to destroy that provision of the firstborn of the father as salvation to the world, we're going to face that same dilemma. We're in the exile. We're not Jewish, most of us. We're not 100% Jewish. We're not going to Orthodox Jewish synagogues. Out of this scattered mass of sheep, what is it that we hold in common? What's the one thing that can bind us together as a people in spite of how different we are and how scattered we are? The one thing that's going to bind us together is going to be our observance of Shabbat and the feast days. And even that's a challenge because we have all kinds of little groups out there who make up their own calendars and quibble over moons and phases and so forth, completely ignoring the scepter that's given to Judah in respect to the Chagim. And so by making all these diverse calendars, they're kind of accomplishing for Pharaoh. Pharaoh doesn't even have to make you go find straw. You just choose to go find straw. You choose the straw man. But see, that's the whole idea. Whether he can make us do it to ourselves or whether Pharaoh actually does it to us, the dilemma is the same. How do we hold on to our Shabbat as our common observance, the one thing that binds us together as a people in exile? But it's actually that ritualistic, and ritualistic I mean by something that you do repeatedly. There are things that you do in your home repeatedly on Shabbat. It might be lighting candles. It might be saying Kiddush. It might be having the best meal of the week. It might be, maybe you make your own challah. There's any number of rituals that you exercise that bind you to a greater body. In other words, you know those things that you're doing, they may not be done exactly the same way all over the world, but there are aspects of these rituals that you're doing that do bind you into the commandment of Shabbat. They're your way of remembering, your way of observing, of guarding the Shabbat. And really, that's all you have that's binding you together in a worship service. We're too scattered. We're kind of in the situation of the Hebrews, scattered out in the fields on Shabbat to gather straw in order to make bricks. And that's why I have to shake my head when people make fun of Jewish rituals in the synagogue as if they are somehow antithetical to the Spirit. And they might be, depending on the individual, they could be. But in terms of the ritual itself, it's just a vehicle that's going to bind you into this greater body of people called Israel, a body of people who would keep Shabbat, who would keep the feasts, and who would know whom to worship on those specific days and every day. If it's antithetical to the Spirit, it's probably the people that are antithetical to it, not the ritual. Yeshua pointed that out when he told about the Pharisee and then the tax collector, because they were both exercising Jewish rituals. But in one, the tax collector, it actually led him to repentance, to exercise that ritual. With the hypocritical Pharisee, it didn't change anything about him. It didn't lead him into the realm of the spirit. But here's what it says in Shemot Rabbah about this Torah portion, and how this was Paro's motivation to make the Hebrews break the Shabbat. He says, with Shabbat taken away from them, they ran the risk of extinction as a nation. In fact, this was what lay at the heart of Paro's harshest decrees. In a sense, the order to withhold straw from the brickmakers was parallel to the decree to throw newborn Jewish males into the river. Both edicts aimed to obliterate Jewish identity. How are you going to spot a Jew? How are you going to spot a Hebrew? Well, they're going to keep the commandments of God, for one thing. That's what's going to bind them together. And so, in the same way that Paro tried to destroy the males by having them thrown into the river, obliterating Shabbat would have destroyed the female. The first mention of a human being who is going to bring up the topic of straw or teven is going to be Rivka. She's going to give us our first mention of straw. But she knows what it's for. She knows it's for camels. She knows it's not for human beings. Which kind of goes back to Esau asking the stupid question, how do you tithe straw? How he would exercise all this effort over the details so that he could ignore both the letter of the Torah and the spirit of the Torah. But Rivka knows that straw is for camels. It's for beasts of burden. And so by sending the Israelites into the fields to find straw on Shabbat, basically Paro makes them beasts of burden. Well, the Torah tells us that even the beast of burden should be able to rest on Shabbat. Rivka, being the first mention, straightens that out for us. She knows how to make the distinction. Straw is for camels, Shabbat is for humans, in terms of taking control of it and what they do on Shabbat. So later, and the point we made last night is when the servant that Abraham had sent to find a wife for Yitzchak, when he saw what she said and what she did, it says he bowed and he worshiped. So it goes back to an act of worship. Really, that's at the core of the straw man. Paro wants to avoid the fact that he's now going to enter into his own tribulation. He's going to be pressed concerning the Israelites and their feasts. So he would rather make it about being lazy than about what is right and what is wrong, what is obedient, what is disobedience. So our first mention of straw is by Rivka. When the servant takes her to Yitzchak, it says Yitzchak takes her into his mother's tent, Sarah's tent. And if you'll remember this from the last Torah cycle, we talked about what was in Sarah's tent, according to the tradition. Remember, there were 3 miracles in Sarah's tent as long as she was alive. It says the candle, the Shabbat candle, remained lit from one Friday to the next. In other words, it was like a menorah in the tabernacle. It was something that was supposed to remain lit. Number 2, the dough was blessed and always sufficed for the family and the guests, just like Yeshua multiplied the dough. And then 3rd, a divine cloud was attached to the tent. In other words, that indwelling presence was what characterized her tent. So those 3 miracles were associated with Sarah. In fact, even in temple times, the western light of the menorah, they said, never went out. But we see how Yeshua, even in the Mount of Transfiguration, you could see this divine cloud that attached itself to him. we went through this and kind of looked at those parallels in the last Torah cycle of Sarah's tent, and how Yeshua brought all these signs, these miraculous signs, with him when he came. And so when Sarah died, they said the presence left. That divine cloud was no longer attached to her tent, like, for instance, it was attached to the Mishkan. But when Rivka entered Sarah's tent, then those miracles were reinstated. The Shabbat miracles were restored, and they say this is what comforted Yitzchak, that the divine cloud came back, the dough was blessed, and the Shabbat candles remain lit. And I think most of us would agree, and even if, we had 50 men sitting here with us, they would probably agree, it's very difficult for a man alone to find comfort in Shabbat. It's something that men don't do well alone. In fact, it's something that not anybody does well alone. Every now and then, you just need to be alone. But for the most part, when we're talking about Shabbat, it's when you want to be surrounded by people of like kind and like mind. And it's especially difficult for men to do Shabbat by themselves, because these lights of Shabbat really are what are going to distinguish darkness and light in a time of darkness. See, if you light your Shabbat candles, even in a day of darkness, you're going to have the light of Shabbat that's going to set you apart. And in terms of how does the wife make the difference on Shabbat? It's because she knows how to make this distinction. Like when we go back to the example of Rivka, she knew how to distinguish straws for camels. Hamakom, the lodging place, she says, is for you. It's for human beings. So Hamakom is for human beings, straws for camels. She makes distinctions. And that's the practice of Shabbat. To this day, it's really the wife who does the major preparation for Shabbat in the home. She's the vital link in distinguishing between Shabbat and the 6 working days. And so to this day, she is symbolic of the comfort of the Ruach HaKodesh in Hamakom that Rivka mentioned. She is truly what ushers in that reverence of Shabbat. She does the majority of prep in terms of the home itself. But see, without the bride, we can take this to a spiritual level and say without the bride, then Shabbat is under threat of extinction in the earth. And the world cannot stand without Shabbat. It's part of its creation. That 7th day of rest is part of its creation. And from the beginning of the world, there's always been a remnant who recognized that. In the same way that you couldn't take away the creation of any other day without destroying the whole world, you cannot take Shabbat away. We only think we can take Shabbat away and not destroy the creation. That's the deception. But the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, will never let you forget that what you don't do on Shabbat is part of the underpinning of the creation. It's part of the legs on which the world is standing today. So yes, the newborn boys faced extinction, but when the decree of the straw went out, it was the females who faced extinction by destroying the Shabbat. That all of a sudden the Shabbat would be mingled with the 6 days of the week. They would be mingling with these Egyptian beasts of the field. There would be a confusion of straw and bricks and other gods, like we had at Babel, where it's first mentioned that they made bricks in order to build a tower up to heaven. And so one of the rabbis explained that had this decree, again, come prior to Moses' visitation, they would not have been able to, they would have completely lost hope. They would have abandoned hope of keeping Shabbat. But because he did appear, see, sometimes you think, well, why isn't he close? Why isn't he helping me? Why isn't he sustaining me? Where is he? If he had not appeared to you already, you would not be sustained even through this period of asking where he is. He has visited you, and he is with you. But there is this disappearance. And you have to realize that even in the midst of where is he, you would not even be here to ask a question had he not already spoken to you. You would not have this hope. And that hope, they say, is what sustained them through that temporary absence of Moses. And having to deal with the consequences of Paro's assertion that Moses is just a liar. Don't listen to Moses. He says, don't listen to these false words. Well, we know who was saying the false words. Why? Because we know how to make distinctions. Where do you learn to make distinctions? Shabbat. That's why Shabbat has so many rules in Orthodox Judaism. So you will never forget that you have to make a distinction, that you will never get out of practice in making a distinction between what is holy and what is mundane. Because if you can distinguish between what is holy and what is mundane, then that's going to help you distinguish between just plain truth and a plain lie at a much lower level. And that's the pattern we see. This revelation of Shabbat will come to people. The revelation of the Chagim, it will come to people. The revelation of the Torah, it will come to people, and it's going to put spirit within them. Remember how it says Jacob revived when he heard that Joseph was alive? Well, this revelation of the Torah comes to you, and it's as if you are Israel and you have heard that Joseph still lives. He's still alive, and it says his spirit revived within him. So even though the obstacles will come, Paro will have you about busy gathering straw on Shabbat. Even though it looks like the world will never accept Shabbat, they will never worship Adonai. It's that hope of the visitation you have already had that's going to sustain you through these brick and straw days. And it's going to the same miracles that Sarah had in her tent, that Rivka had in the tent, that Yeshua brought to the tent. Miraculous bread from heaven, miraculous light that never goes out, because it's the light of Shabbat and the Ruach HaKodesh, the presence of Adonai. You have to know that that's what's going to sustain you, even when you find yourself out in a field gathering straw on Shabbat. Remember, the role of the straw man is to confuse you, like the tzira. It confuses above and it cuts off fruit below. So you have to expect during these times when you feel like Moses is missing from the world, that you don't have to succumb to the confusion. You might be in the field gathering straw, but you are not confused as to why you're there. And you are not confused as to whether your Redeemer still lives. And this is what he says. He says, you are no longer to give the people straw, to make brick as previously. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. So let's look at these words here. And I put the Hebrew in there. And then I put in the kind of brownish gold so you could see the key words that I want to look at. Because the action of gathering straw is very specific. In Hebrew, you have specific words for what you're gathering. Like I think it's katsir for gathering grapes. You have mekokesh for gathering straw. Depending on what kind of produce you're gathering, Hebrew has a specific word to describe the action. The specific action of gathering straw, as you can see in the text there, which I went ahead and put the koksheshu, but just your plain subject verb present tense is going to be mekokesh, or if it's feminine, mekokeshet. But mekokesh is typically going to refer to gathering straw, not anything else. So if we were to find that word in Teven, by the way, if you can read the Hebrew there, that's the word for straw. So basically he says, V'kosheshu lehem teven. So if you were to find kosheshu or mekokesh in reference to gathering something other than straw, you would look at that and say, there's an anomaly there. Let me check this out because this is not really normal. So let's go to Numbers 15:32, because that would be, going back to our original question. Well, how do we know that this incident has anything at all to do with working on Shabbat? Let's find this word in another context where maybe it doesn't fit there. And so it says, now while the sons of Israel were in the wilderness, remember they asked to go and celebrate a chag in the wilderness, 3 days journey. So now they are in the wilderness, wandering around. It says, while the sons of Israel, never forget, we're still talking about firstborn issues, Israel as an extension of the Father and the representation of the Father. While the sons of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering wood on the Sabbath day. Those who found him gathering wood brought him to Moses and Aharon and to all the congregation. And they put him in custody because it had not been declared what should be done to him. Then the Lord said to Moshe, the man shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. Hang on a sec. Pull this up because it's telling me my screen sharing is paused. Can you guys see the screen? You can? Okay. I'm getting a weird message. He says, all the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. So all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him to death with stones, just as the Lord had commanded Moshe. Now that sounds a little harsh. But if you read the text carefully, there's more going on here than just, oops, caught him gathering wood, let's kill him. It's much deeper than that. And we're going to go into the next slide and look at some things. We want to look at the full context of this. Can you see that?
No, it didn't change. When you went to the numbers reference, numbers did not come up. That slide didn't come up.
Let me try again. How about now? If I do...
Yes, I'm seeing Numbers 15:20 through 20. Well, at the top, the second paragraph. Where are you trying to get? Tell me when you're there.
Okay. Does it say context for Shabbat gathering?
Yes, ma'am.
That's where we need to be. I'm not sure what happened there. I was trying to move it where I could read it, and I think I probably hit something. We want to look at the full context of this Shabbat gathering, because I think it's going to help us decode what's going on in the Torah portion in terms of the gathering, the straw. So what is the context? And it's kind of strange, because you think, well, maybe these two things don't really go together. But if they're in context, they do. So keep in the back of your mind, what I'm about to read is going to lead me directly into this example of a man caught gathering wood on Shabbat. So he says, of the first of your dough, you shall lift up a cake as an offering. As the offering of the threshing floor, so you shall lift up. From the first of your dough, you shall give to the Lord an offering throughout your generations. But when you unwittingly fail and do not observe all these commandments, which the Lord has spoken to Moshe, even all that the Lord has commanded you through Moshe, from the day when the Lord gave the commandment and onward throughout your generations, then it shall be, if it is done unintentionally, without the knowledge of the congregation, that all the congregation shall offer one bull for a burnt offering as a soothing aroma to the Lord, with its grain offering and its drink offering according to the ordinance, and one male goat for a sin offering. Then the priest shall make atonement for all the congregation. See how many times he's repeating all the congregation? The same way when we brought the wood gatherer. All the congregation of the sons of Israel, they will be forgiven, for it was an error. And they have brought their offering, an offering by fire to the Lord, and their sin offering before the Lord for their error. So all the congregation of the sons of Israel will be forgiven, with the alien who sojourns among them, for it happened to all the people through error. So our context leading up to this incident with the Shabbat gathering is, okay, people, I'm about to tell you a story about a Sabbath breaker. But before I tell you the story about the Sabbath breaker, I want you to understand some things about the commandments. First of all, I want you to relate it to the first fruits of your dough. And remember, that's one of the miracles of Sarah's tent, was the dough that never ran out. It was always sufficient for everyone for Shabbat. So it has at least a rabbinic context already to the Shabbat, because the dough is going to be seen to this day. If you're making challah for Shabbat, you pinch off a piece of the dough, and typically you'll burn it up in the oven. You might wrap it in foil and throw it in the oven to be burned up there, or throw it on a grill or whatever. But you symbolically still take the first of that dough for Shabbat and you offer it up. But then he moves from there, from what we would say is a Shabbat context and the dough. And he says, some things are going to happen and you're not going to intend to do them. It's going to be against your will. It says here unwittingly, in error. In other words, you're not doing it on purpose. You may not, in some cases, like the Hebrews, have a choice. Pharaoh said, you go gather straw on Shabbat or you die, basically. And so were they working on Shabbat? Yes. Did they want to work on Shabbat? No. And see, that's where we get into, we could avoid a lot of arguments today where we recognize, I don't want to work on Shabbat. I'm going to do everything I can not to work on Shabbat. It's not my will to work on Shabbat, but I'm in Egypt. I'm not living in Israel where it's easy to take off on Shabbat, because it would be the unusual thing for me to be working on Shabbat in Israel. But I'm in Egypt. I'm in the exile, and I'm going to make some errors. Now, I'm not saying this is an excuse to just go about your merry business on Shabbat and have no ounce of remorse about it. Because again, if he's revealed it to you, you better understand he'll be back. He's only disappeared for a little while. The Redeemer will return. And that's what I say, cheer up, it gets worse. The plagues are coming in order to free you from these errors that you might be forced to make on Shabbat, in order to preserve your life or your children's lives or your grandparents' lives or whoever you're responsible for as a firstborn of Israel. You're responsible for the family. And so there are some people, it's easier for them to disengage from labor on Shabbat by virtue of their occupation. For others, it's not so easy. But the question is, do they want to? Is this against their will? Is it in their heart, if there were any other way for me to put food in my kids' mouths, if there were any other way, if I knew what to do, I would do it. to me, that's exactly what this passage is setting up for us before we go into the Shabbat breaker. So we will know the difference between this person who's committing an unintentional sin, and then the one we're about to read about who's going to do it on purpose and without repentance, even when it says all the congregation corrects him. Until all the congregation can come to you and correct you, you have to be really, really, really careful about how you're judging other people's Shabbat observance, because that's exactly what happens. Now that we have that example, then he takes us into the Shabbat breaker. Once we understand the whole congregation can sin unintentionally. But when we reach a place in that wilderness where it's possible for the whole congregation to come to this person and say, hey, wait a minute, Moses came back. We're out of Egypt. We don't serve Pharaoh anymore. Your life does not depend on this piece of wood you're picking up. You're just doing it. When we reach that point, now we have an unrepentant, rebellious, intentional Sabbath breaker. In fact, probably a lot of your Christian friends, if you said, you know, when Messiah returns, don't you think we're going to keep the Shabbat? They might say yes. Well, would you keep it then? Yes. But not now? No. All right. But when the whole congregation comes to them and said, hey, Yeshua said we take off on the seventh day, they're probably going to say, okay. I would say a very small minority of people are truly rebellious. Once they know what to do, and it's easy to do it. But when you're doing it, even when it's hard, when you are making sacrifices, maybe giving up that promotion, maybe not earning as much as you could, yes, that will be rewarded. But in the meantime, don't judge the unintentional sinner too harshly. Are they in sin? Yes. It's wrong. Absolutely, it's wrong. But he has set up this whole situation so we will recognize something in the Sabbath breaker. And so it says also that the alien with them will be forgiven when they are able to return to the commandment given through Moshe. Okay, let me go right back up here so you can take one more glance at that passage. Because it says it happened to all the people through error. Right? So that's the preface to the Sabbath breaker. And there will be an atonement, by the way. Once there is freedom, once there is recognition, then there is going to be a sacrifice brought, some act of recognition that we have sinned, we have been wrong, we didn't mean to offend the Father, it wasn't our intention to offend the Father, somebody told me the wrong thing, I believed the wrong thing, well, I knew to do the right thing, but I couldn't do it overnight. I couldn't change my life overnight. And the Father knows that you can't change your life overnight when you live in Egypt, when you're called out of Egypt. It takes a while. So that's when I say, take heart. Even when you feel like Moses is missing and Yeshua is missing, they're not. They're not. And they loved you so much, they gave you the hope to sustain you through this period, until all the congregation is going to recognize the sin. All the congregation. And so let's go back to the intentional Sabbath breaker. It says, now while the sons of Israel were in the wilderness, there was a man gathering wood on the Sabbath day. And then it says again, those who found him gathering wood. All right, so there's a little play on words here. we say gathering wood, but the word there, you can see it in Hebrew, it's mekakesh. Remember, mekakesh refers to straw. It doesn't refer to gathering wood. There's a different word for gathering wood that I'll show you. But when we're talking about gathering straw, we would say mekakesh. But all of a sudden, we got a Sabbath breaker out here in the wilderness, and it says mekakesh etzim. He's gathering straw. No, he's gathering wood. But it's the verb you use for straw. And it says etzim. That means trees. He's gathering trees on the Shabbat day. That means, symbolically, he's gathering people. He's collecting a following. A following of who? People who don't want to keep the Shabbat. Birds of a feather flock together, right? So we have a little rebellion. We don't have a random Sabbath breaker who just forgot what day it was, or he got bored and decided to go pick up sticks. It's none of those conditions that would lead to something unintentional, in error, just I did something stupid. This is intentional. And remember, mekakesh, it refers to the straw. It's what a beast eats. He's gathering people. That's the potential. Now, he may not literally be gathering people, but the trees represent the people that he will gather into his rebellion. And it says twice, they caught him gathering wood. The implication is, when we're looking at trees, we've got fruitful trees and we've got unfruitful trees. Remember what the tzila does. It confuses you above and then it cuts off the fruit below. When you're out gathering wood on Shabbat, either you're confused above or you're trying to cut off fruit below. Because if you're working on Shabbat, it is not going to bear good fruit. It's going to bear the opposite kind of fruit. So he rejects Shabbat. And by these actions, he's inviting others to join him, other trees, other unfruitful trees, to join them in an intentional sin. Not a oops, an intentional. Because remember, it's basically, it says, well, the sons of Israel were in the wilderness. They found a man. Okay, who found him? The sons of Israel. That's more than one. Gathering wood on the Sabbath day. Those who found him gathering wood brought him to Moses, and it says to all the congregation. What's the point of bringing him to all the congregation? So that they will reprove him and correct him. And when all the congregation rebukes you and you still go out and want to gather wood, then that's when you have an intentional sin. That's when you have a rebellious sin. It's as if the first time they warned him, they stayed it once, he's gathering wood, and then it restates it. It's like he had a warning and he went right back out and did it again. And so he was brought before all the congregation. And still, you see the condition that was set this up. He says, okay, if you realize you've done this unintentionally, when all the congregation comes to this agreement, then you bring a sacrifice to acknowledge, yes, I was wrong, and I don't intend to do it this way again. You're not getting any of these, all of this setup that has led to this point. You don't see any evidence that this wood gatherer / straw gatherer of the Sabbath day intends to change one thing about his behavior. Instead, he intends to recruit more to his way of doing things. So we have a context. that helps us understand the difference between breaking Moses' words in error to one who is going to break it intentionally without remorse. And it says in Numbers 15:30, but the person who does anything defiantly, whether he's native or alien, that one is blaspheming the Lord. And that person shall be cut off from among his people because he has despised the word of the Lord and has broken his commandment. That person shall be completely cut off. His guilt will be upon him. In other words, there's no real sacrifice for that. The sacrifice was when all the congregation confronted you and you said, no, I prefer sin. That's defiance and that's blasphemy. And there's no point in bringing a guilt offering. It's not going to do any good because you don't feel guilty. But that's the guideline. All the congregation, you have to have an ability to distinguish, to even know, number one, that you've committed a sin, or to know that you have committed the sin unintentionally against your will, or whether you've not just done it, you've known you've done it. The congregation confronts you and says this is wrong. And if you're still committed to defy him, then that's going to be probably a very small minority of people. Because it wasn't just Moses' word that was violated. It wasn't Adonai's word only that was violated. It was all that along with all the congregation's correction. All of the congregation had a part in trying to reform the behavior of the Sabbath gatherer. And he rejected all of it. He rejected his family. He rejected his God. And he rejected his leader. So all of the congregation has to determine whether the man gathered the wood or the straw in error rebelliously. If he refuses to repent, then, of course, the stoning went into effect. But the clue there was mekokesh, that he's gathering the trees like straw. He's trying to confuse the sons of Israel, who are learning to make a distinction between Shabbat and the workdays. They're out in the wilderness, they're in process, just like we are. We are learning how to make a distinction between Shabbat and workdays, and we mess up sometimes. But we don't do it on purpose. Most mistakes are because we don't know better. And this is the best we can do with where we are. But taking it back to the straw, which we know is a point of confusion, it's about who we worship. It's not about the trees. It's not about the straw. It's about who we worship and when we worship him and how we worship him. How we distinguish between Shabbat and the weekdays. And the clue there in mekokesh tells you that he was unrepentant because of the way that it's conjugated. It's in the present progressive tense, like an ongoing thing. Instead of saying he gathered, it says he is gathering. He continues to gather. And guess what? He's still gathering. In terms of what is inspiring the person that's recorded in the Torah, and what is inspiring probably a small number of people who are doing it on purpose, they would continue to gather no matter how many warnings they receive from the sons of Israel, from the father, from the leader, how many pleas, how many warnings. This person is never going to stop. But again, remember, it's a small number as opposed to the greater number. When you talk about gathering wood, it's usually osef, not mekokesh. And so the text intentionally pointed us back to the straw man, pointed us back to the situation of the Hebrew slaves who had to mekokesh the straw, gathering on Shabbat against their will, disheartened, depressed, beaten down, without, much hope for this Moses. Where did he go? They've just got one little shred of hope left. It's like they've lost their light, they've lost the bread, they've lost the presence. They feel like the obstacles are too great to overcome. They feel like they've been given a death sentence. If they lose Shabbat, they're going to lose their whole identity. When humankind ceases to keep Shabbat, then the created world, it can't stand. Those were the 7 pillars that stand. And so we have another textual anomaly, not just using the straw verb with the wood on Shabbat, but the word that should have been used for gathering the wood, osef, that word actually pops up in Paro's mouth concerning the straw. And in Exodus 5:7, we can see, well, that's the Hebrew there. You are no longer, and that word there is tosifun, to give the people straw to make bricks as previously. Let them go and gather mekakesh, straw for themselves. So do not add to the people. That's what tosifun means, to add or to gather, coming from osef. And so it applies here. He says, I don't want you to add to them straw. And so we've got a little hint here to the Feast of Sukkot, the Feast of Ingathering, Asif. But it's misspelled. That's what draws our attention to the fact that a word that we would associate with gathering this wood, or a word that we would associate with Asif, the Feast of Sukkot, is because there's a misspelling of what Pharaoh actually says. I'll flip it back here so you can see the misspelling. It's the first word there in blue, tosifun. You don't need that aleph. See where it says tav aleph? You do not need that aleph in that word. It's unnecessary. It's already in the imperative. So it's going to use the tav. It's not going to use the aleph, which would make it more like singular, future tense. Like I will. You put the aleph on. So there's an unnecessary aleph in that imperative. And so we have this confrontation between Moshe and Paro. It's going to lead eventually, we know, to Pesach. But remember, Moses said, let us go out into the wilderness to celebrate a Chag, 3 days journey. He doesn't really specify which Chag. Typically, a Chag is going to be at Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. But he says 3 days. To me, that's significant because it would assign a day for each of the foot festivals, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Maybe a little play on words there, not sure. But Paro is hinting to Sukkot in what he says, that the Hebrews are not to be given Sukkot. That's the hint. He says, don't give them straw, but the idea is, I don't want you to give them Sukkot. I don't want you to give them the Chagim. Paro is always going to be an obstacle between you and your Sukkot, you and your Pesach, you and your Shabbat, you and your Shavuot. That's his job, based on who he is and where he's from in Egypt. It says, you shall work 6 days, but on the 7th day you shall rest. Even during plowing time and harvest you shall rest. You shall celebrate the Feast of Weeks. That is the first fruits, the bikurei. There's our word again from last week, of the wheat harvest. And the Feast of Ingathering. In this text, it's called Ha'asif, at the turn of the year, that's Sukkot. 3 times a year, all your males are to appear before the Lord God, the God of Israel. That's from Exodus 34, 21 through 23. So the context of these, Sabbath, first fruits, the 3 foot festivals, those are linked together. When you're talking about the Shabbat, you're also talking about the Moedim. When you're talking about the Moedim and Shabbat, you're also talking about Bikoreh, the first fruit, the firstborn, the thing most like the Father. And each of those chagim is going to require a high Sabbath at some point. Each chag is going to have some kind of a sacrifice of first fruit. It might be the barley. It might be the wheat. It might be from your flocks and your herds at Sukkot. And what are these? These are extensions of the Father. And maybe this is why Moses is saying 3 days journey. He wants each day to represent one of the chagim of the first fruit. And so when the Israelites left Egypt at Pesach, their first stop was at Sukkot. They entered the clouds of glory. There's also called Sukkot of glory. And this is the point. If Paro can destroy the Israelites' rest on Shabbat by withholding straw, then he also thinks he can destroy their Sukkot. If they think they're going to go out here in the wilderness and start celebrating these Passovers and these Sukkots and these Shavuots, well, I'll just show them, I'll destroy their weekly Shabbat, and they'll lose all hope of these extra vacation days they're asking for. That's what it says. You shall celebrate the Feast of Sukkot 7 days after you've gathered asif in from your threshing floor and your wine vat. Right? And so what Paro is doing here is committing suicide. He doesn't understand why it is so important for the firstborn Israel to celebrate Sukkot. He doesn't understand why it's so important for them to celebrate Shabbat, to preserve these things until all the congregation is filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Until everyone can agree this is the Shabbat, until everyone can agree these are the holidays, and if you are not observing them, then we can all reprove you. But that's the era of wickedness and rebellion. Rebellion is suicide. Paro does not realize he's committing suicide by preventing them from keeping Shabbat and the feasts, because Sukkot is the feast of the nations. It's where those sacrifices are made on behalf of the nations. The world depends upon the firstborn Israel. And the world depends upon the firstborn Messiah, the Father's Son, the extension of himself that is most like himself. And I think Sukkot is singled out in Zechariah because it's still a holiday of the future. It's not that each of these won't be replayed prophetically, but at this point, Sukkot still is a holiday of the future and of the nations. It's of Israel, the Lamb, the Shabbat light. It's what it says in Revelation 21:23. The city has no need of the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God has illumined it, and its lamp is the Lamb. That is a lamp, and that is the presence that's never going to go out in that city. And this is why we need Israel to keep the Shabbat. This is why we need Israel to keep the feasts. This is why we don't need them out gathering straw in the fields. It says in Zechariah 14:16, it will come about that any who are left of the nations who went against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to celebrate the Feast of Sukkot. And I know the temptation is to make that this big apocalyptic prediction, but let's just make it simple. Jerusalem is the seat and the focal point of the Moedim. When you go against Jerusalem, what's actually happening is the same thing that Paro did and sending the Hebrews out to gather straw. and telling them they can't go celebrate a Chag, telling them, I'm not going to give you straw, I'm not going to add that to you, he's actually destroying the very things that could sustain the earth. And so that's my thing is, who did not go against Jerusalem. The nations that are left are going to be the ones who can come into agreement about Shabbat. It's going to be the nations who can come into agreement about the feast days. And what is proper behavior on those days when all the congregation will be agreed. And so Sukkot is the hope of the nations, whether they know it or understand it or not, whether they are actively trying to kill themselves by preventing people from keeping the Shabbat or keeping the Chagim. They don't know they're committing suicide any more than Pharaoh knew he was committing suicide, because that is the deception. Remember, the tzila, it confuses you, it blinds you above, and then it cuts off your fruit below. Then it cuts off your Sukkot. Then it cuts off your hope of glory. So there will be a time coming. It says, when the knowledge of the Lord will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. But until then, until all the congregation is able to correct the Sabbath breaker, until all the congregation is able to instruct someone who doesn't know what the appointed times are, we have to be the assembly of the firstborn. We can't lose hope just because it looks like Yeshua and Moses took a break. They are not taking a break. They are preparing us to prepare the world. We can't lose courage at this point, even if we make Shabbat errors. They are unintentional. I guarantee you there's nobody in this class right now or that will listen to this recording who makes a mistake on Shabbat and intends to and doesn't care. You do care, which is why you're in this class. So don't become disheartened. Don't let Pharaoh take the courage out of you when you have to make mistakes against your will. If it's truly against your will, you just hold on to that light until all the congregation assembles in that day. When he takes away those obstacles, until the day when it's truly amazing that anybody would make a mistake. But don't judge yourself today according to the criteria of a millennium under the kingdom of Yeshua. But it's not an excuse to fail. It's an inspiration to succeed, because he's depending upon us to be the firstborn of his will, so that all those people out there will know when Shabbat is, just because we're stubborn about it. We don't have to be hateful about it, but we do have to be stubborn about it. And because we do keep his feast, they will know that there's something else out there other than maybe what they have learned. If we can avoid gathering straw in the field on Shabbat, we avoid it. It's not a license to do whatever we want, but it's intended to inspire you that sometimes you have to do what you don't want. And it's okay. He's made provision for that. He knows where we are. And as long as it's not our will, eventually he will make a way. Yeshua will return. Moses will return. Conditions will change. Pharaoh won't always be in charge. And then, of course, we can end up here with Isaiah 11, 6-10. That says, the wolf will dwell with the lamb, and the leopard will lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together. And a little boy will lead them. Also the cow and the bear will graze, Their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. The nursing child will play by the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child will put his hand on the viper's den. They will not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. For the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Then in that day, the nations will resort to the root of Yeshai, who will stand as a signal for the peoples, and his resting place will be glorious. So these carnivorous beasts of the field are going to start eating straw, just like a clean beast. The idol-worshiping nations, they're going to know the difference between straw and grain. They're going to have a change in nature. The confusion will be gone. We can start to bear fruit again. We'll be able to accept a rebuke. We're not in a stage of our spiritual growth typically where we do receive a rebuke well. Even if we're not confused and we know the person is right, it still hurts when somebody rebukes us. But when a rebuke comes, if it's given with lots of mercy, with lots of grace, we want to receive that. Even if I can't improve upon it right now, it gives me a goal. It gives me something to shoot for in the future. And even if I can't get out of this field right now, I'm going to start walking. I'm going to try to start figuring out. And what I've found that typically when we want to change something in a good way, the Father meets us there eventually. He does open up ways here and there. And it's our responsibility just to live that light in front of people. You know, there's going to be plenty of room in the makom. That's what Rivka said when the servant asked. She says, there is plenty of room in the makom. And there's going to be plenty of straw for the camels. Which this is just more like me wrapping up my thoughts yesterday. Kind of commenting on the social political situation in the United States today. And I would say worldwide, just seeing from what I see about world politics. We've become even more Egyptian than the Egyptians. People have accepted a pseudo-religion of humanism because they just think the God of the Bible is too mean, or he's just too uninvolved in the world situation, and it's all up to us to build the tower. And so we got to be careful, because they're building religions out of things like this straw man fallacy. If you look at it, there's things that need to be addressed. And the treatment of women, yes, there are things that need to be addressed. It doesn't mean that feminism is the vehicle for that. Because how can you be for women and destroy manhood? See, the Torah stands forever. How we feel about gender roles will change by the day. Eco-preservation. Yes, we are in charge of our planet. He put us here to care for it, to care for the animals. But there just doesn't seem to be any balance in the arguments. There are people who would promote the life of animals over the lives of human beings. They don't know the difference between a human and a camel, between a grain of wheat and the straw. When we get the order right, then one should take care of the other. But they'll always use these valid life issues. But when you look at the motivation, it's like with Pharaoh. He just used the issue to cover up the real problem. And that the problem was, who do we worship? And when do we worship him? And when somebody says they're bringing you goodness and truth, but they're really introducing confusion and destroying fruit, then we know what spirit they're of. And that rest definitely is not glorious. So, yes, I do have a metal straw, so I put a picture of it in there, but I also have plastic straws too. And so just my encouragement is do the absolute best you can with Shabbat and his feasts, but don't major on the minors. Esau wanted to know how you tithe straw. The hypocrites wanted to know how you tithe mint, dill, and cumin. And Yeshua wants to know, have we been just, have we been merciful, and have we been faithful to his word? And that's what he says. You know, what does he require of us? But to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with him. What is tevin? It is straw. And so that's how we looked up the first mention of straw, to try to figure out what was its context. And basically the context was making a distinction between feeding humans and feeding camels. Because the camel is the transportation, it's the vehicle, it's the means, and it carries valuable things, but the valuable thing is the human being that it carries. And so she offers drink to the human being, to the servant first, and then she offers drink to the camels. So they all get a drink, but in order. And then for the human being, she says, yes, there is makom. There's place, which is like that play on words with the temple. Yes, there's room in my Father's house for you. And then she says, we got straw for the camels too, which kind of throws us back into that Isaiah prophecy of, you know, even the carnivores will be able to eat the straw because of a nature change. And tevin is going to be tav, veit, nun, sofit. And I had that thought as I looked at it, and I didn't chase it down. But the tav is the seal and the ben is the sun, so there might be something to see there.